title of my project is Mennonites and the Development of Religious Toleration in Early Modern Europe, 1645 to 1700. So during this time, the Dutch Mennonites were tolerated and successful economically. On your right is a commissioned portrait of a Dutch Mennonite family from Amsterdam in 1671. The family is obviously wealthy. You can see they're in a nice home, and with gardens in the background. They have the money to participate in music. You see the child playing the instrument there. We also dressed very well. So the Dutch Mennonites were tolerated and very successful economically. By contrast, the Swiss Anabaptists were persecuted and financially destitute because of persecution. As you can see in the etching, Swiss Anabaptists were violently taken from their homes. They were imprisoned, and their property was taken from them before they were often exiled from the Swiss cantons. So during the 17th century, the Dutch Mennonites helped the persecuted Swiss Anabaptists, and the relationship between these two groups is the subject of this study. Just a little more historical background on the Dutch Mennonites. So this is a painting by Rembrandt. It's called Syndics of the Drapers' Guild by Rembrandt in 1622. Depicted in the painting are the wardens of the Cloth Guild, and significantly, there is a Mennonite, a Remonstrant, 2 Catholics, and a Reformed Protestant that are all part of this guild. So 2 points to notice from this painting. First is that toleration was the norm, because the Dutch saw the economic benefits of tolerating people. The second one is that Mennonites were very involved in the society around them, as demonstrated by the presence of a Mennonite with the Cloth Guild. Because of economic success, Dutch Mennonites contributed significantly to the tax revenue of the Netherlands and also accrued significant wealth. The second painting is called The Mennonite Preacher Onslow and His Wife by Rembrandt in 1641, and Dr. Lehman just informed me that it's apparently the centerpiece at an art museum in Berlin, so if anyone ever goes to Berlin, you should check this painting out. So, the fact that a Mennonite pastor could commission a painting demonstrates that they were indeed very wealthy. When the Swiss Anabaptists asked for help in the 1640s, the Dutch were well positioned to help them. The Dutch responded with aid and with letters of intercession, asking the Swiss Reformed to tolerate the Swiss Anabaptists. Furthermore, the Dutch Mennonites because of their contributions to Dutch society, were positioned to garner support from the government, as well as Dutch intellectuals to lobby for religious toleration in the Swiss cantons. So, before I get into my argument, some of the motivations for this project is I have an interest in Anabaptist history because that's my heritage. Secondly, I've always loved Dutch history, particularly the Dutch Golden Age. And so when I was on a train to the Netherlands last spring, I thought maybe I could do a capstone project on the Dutch Mennonites in the Dutch Golden Age. And so Dr. Lehman told me about this anthology of translated letters from archives around Europe that contains the letters of intercession and also records of how the Dutch helped the persecuted Swiss. So some of the research questions in going about this project are, why did the Dutch government and the Dutch professors lobby on behalf of the Swiss Mennonites? Another one is, how did the Swiss Anabaptists and Dutch Mennonites contribute to the rise of religious toleration in early modern Europe? So this is the main question that I am dealing with, is I'm trying to develop an argument for how they contributed to this concept of toleration that was arising in Europe among common people, intellectuals, and political leaders. So the significance of this project. So it demonstrates an Anabaptist contribution to modern society. It is a story of brotherly love. Anabaptists and Mennonites, despite their difference, worked together to help the persecuted Swiss. Also, they worked with people from other confessions. They worked with the Reformed and the Remonstrants. So you see kind of an ecumenical action of aid happening. So, and it's also an inspiration for present-day Anabaptists and others to appreciate Anabaptist history. I've noticed that, especially among young Anabaptists, we don't really know our history or appreciate it very much. So I think demonstrating that Anabaptists were forerunners of a lot of the things that modern society takes for granted should make us appreciate our history. So some of the scholarship on religious toleration that I surveyed when I was doing just trying to understand like the topic of religious toleration, as there's like two schools of thought. One is that it comes from the Enlightenment, and there's also this idea that it comes from the bottom up of just people practicing it. So one scholar, Perez Zagoran, he argues that religious toleration comes from the Enlightenment. So in his book, In How the Idea of Religious Toleration Came to the West, Zagoran traces the intellectual history of religious toleration by arguing that the concept was championed by Enlightenment thinkers such as Pierre Bayle, John Locke, Baruch Spinoza, and Voltaire. This is the idea that religious toleration comes from the intellectual and political elite, like a top-down approach to religious toleration. Taking a different view, Benjamin Kaplan argues for a more bottom-up approach to religious toleration. Talking about scholarship more broadly, he states, quote, "At the heart of a recent revolution in scholarship lays a single insight, that elites are not all-powerful and that other sorts of people, peasants and craftsmen, women and minorities, played an active role in shaping the past. Such people formerly without history now receive as much attention as do philosophers and kings," end quote. So building on recent scholarship in both social and cultural histories, Kaplan describes how Europeans practiced social toleration, defined as the peaceful coexistence of different faiths living together in the same village or town, long before the Enlightenment idea of toleration became widely known. So what Kaplan's thesis is, so some of us read it in Reformation, is that rather than enforcing religious toleration, religious toleration just came through the practice of people with differing beliefs learning to navigate conflict. And you will see why that's important for my argument later. So what's missing from the scholarship? Specifically, the story of Dutch Mennonite aid and how that contributes to religious toleration. And secondly, showing how religious toleration comes from all levels of society. So a lot of scholars focus on an either or. I make the argument that by looking at how the Dutch Mennonites interceded on behalf of Swiss Anabaptists, it actually comes from all levels of society. So my thesis is the 17th century Dutch Mennonites and Swiss Anabaptists contributed to the rise of religious toleration in early modern Europe by influencing all levels of the communities where they lived: common people, church leaders, intellectuals, and political leaders. So an overview of the three of the four arguments I make, I'm only talking about three of them today, are, first of all, through social toleration. This is a painting of like Bern in the 17th century, and the town of Bern was also a canton, like a larger region. So Swiss Anabaptists peacefully coexisted with their Reformed neighbors despite persecution, which is in line with Kaplan's thesis about social toleration. Secondly, through political lobbying, this is a picture of the States General in session in the Netherlands. And the States General actually lobbied on behalf of Swiss Anabaptists per the request of Dutch Mennonites. So lobbying, political and intellectual lobbying. And finally, through inspiring intellectual arguments. So this is a photo of John Locke. My last evidence is how this persecution or this crisis is part of what inspired John Locke to write his letter on toleration, which became very influential later. So my first evidence is for social toleration. So, okay. For some reason, my statement, apologize. There we go. So the Swiss Anabaptists practiced social toleration by peacefully coexisting with their Reformed neighbors despite persecution by the authorities. So the evidence for this is the late Mennonite scholar John Oyer wrote, quote, "Layfolk in Canton Bern revered the Mennonites and burnished their public image for living in moral purity and with integrity." Mennonites were the best, most pious, dead to the world Christians anywhere. Reformed layfolk assigned a superior religious rank in the sight of God to these expressions and forms of godly righteousness. They believed the Mennonites were Christians of a godly caliber. So before I continue, I want to do a little caveat. So Anabaptists, by about the 17th century, were taking on the name Mennonite, even though they were technically started before the Mennonites, just because Anabaptists had a sort of a derogatory term. So sometimes throughout this presentation, I refer to Swiss as either Mennonites or Anabaptists because they were going by both names. So John Orr, he makes this statement because he analyzed a polemic written by a Reformed pastor in the 1690s named George Thorman. George Thorman wrote this polemic to try to convince Bernese to stop joining the Anabaptists. That demonstrates that they were very influential and very popular. Significantly, Thorman had to write his polemic with a sympathetic attitude toward Bernese Mennonites because that is the only way he could convince the Bernese common people not to join them. He had to show they are pretty cool, but they're actually wrong. So that's essentially the way he tried to convince them. So 2 points is that this demonstrates that they were admired, which brought an increase. Well, it demonstrates that they had influence over their neighbors, and if they admired them, that means they lived peacefully with them. So religious toleration also, or social toleration also happened in Zurich. In a letter from Petrus Vocunier to the States General, he was the Dutch diplomat lobbying on behalf of the persecuted Swiss Anabaptists, he writes, quote, "Because the Swiss peasant is on average rather simple and in consequence rather opinionated and tends greatly towards humility, for around 30 years many of those people in the canton of Zurich have taken on the religion of the Mennonites. The government of Zurich, seeing the increase of these people and fearing that most of the peasants would join that denomination and thereby lay down the use of arms, which is Switzerland's only force, has succeeded in blocking the progress of by the making of and carrying out of a certain legal decree." So there demonstrates that, like in Bern, the Zurich Anabaptists were gaining numbers because of their popularity. And that's why, part of the reason why the Zurich officials wanted to persecute them. But it also demonstrates that if they were joining them, that if people were joining the Anabaptists, they were also living peacefully with them. But not everyone joined the Anabaptists. There were some who admired them but didn't, as this quote from a Bern edict against Anabaptists in 1659 demonstrates. So these people are hard to catch, since they are hidden and concealed even by others, by those whom they are related by marriage or other ties, especially those with whom there's little knowledge of God and zeal for religion to be found. So what this quote demonstrates is that some people, although they didn't join them, liked them and admired them, and so they were willing to hide them when the Anabaptist hunters would come around trying to imprison them and exile them from the Swiss cantons. Okay. So in summary, social toleration is they were admired by the Swiss Reformed common people. They influenced them, and this demonstrates that social toleration existed among common people. But it also brought persecution. So the next evidence for how Mennonites contributed to religious toleration is through political and intellectual lobbying. So Mennonites influenced religious toleration through intellectual and political lobbying, calling Swiss political and intellectual elites to give an account for their violence against Swiss Anabaptists. They did this through sending letters of intercession and convincing Dutch politicians and intellectuals to intercede for them. One very influential figure who did this was a wealthy Dutch Mennonite merchant named Hans Bloming, who used his business skills to lobby and also convince Dutch to lobby for them. So he wrote letters to Swiss professors himself. So he's not an intellectual, but he's actually writing directly to Swiss professors, giving arguments for religious toleration. Also a note on this is not Hans Bloming, but it is a representation of a Dutch merchant in the 17th century. So secondly, he inspired Dutch professors to intercede. And third, he helped garner support from the Dutch government. So Next, I have a letter from the city of Amsterdam to the Zurich government in February of 1660. This is like probably in response to the edict in 1659 that was against Anabaptists. They wrote, a rather notable number of our burghers, who because of their religion are called Anabaptists, have shown us that because of the placard published against them, those of their faith have been forced since some years to abandon their homes and properties in the canton of Zurich. End quote. So the people of the government of Amsterdam is equating Swiss Anabaptists with Dutch Mennonites, even though technically they're separate groups. They continued, they are the sort of people who, under our government and that of our predecessors, have lived in this town and are still living there and several other towns in this nation, contributing everything imposed on them gladly for the maintenance of the republic and fulfilling the duty of good citizens and subjects, and who have never failed, when called upon, to show an extraordinary charity. So the argument of this, they then proceed to ask for religious toleration for the Swiss Anabaptists. The argument for this letter is as follows. The Dutch Mennonites are good citizens in our country, so you should tolerate the Mennonites in your country as well. What was the Dutch response? No. They said they are ruining the stability of our country. So, in some cases, persecution was alleviated, prisoners were freed, property returned, but for the most part, Swiss officials just justified their persecutions. While this didn't bring immediate changes, I think it has it inspired discussion about religious toleration, which has long-term effects that are hard to trace, like changing somebody's mind about how they should relate to religion, and doesn't happen overnight. So I have another example of intercession that is pretty significant. So King William III, King of Great Britain, and the States General interceded for a period of 3 years for Mennonites living in the Palatinate region. They were, in 1694, by the command of the Elector over the Palatinate. It was a province in the Holy Roman Empire. Armed peasants and soldiers attacked Mennonites living there, imprisoning them and confiscating their property. The Elector claimed that he had the right to do this because of edicts of Charles V, who had established the right in the early 16th century to punish dissenting religious groups such as the Anabaptists. The edicts that the early Anabaptists suffered under were being reinstituted. Consequently, the Dutch Mennonites convinced William III to lobby on behalf of them. So here's a letter from William III to the leader of the ruler of the Palatinate named Johann Wilhelm. He said, quote, I feel assured that you will be very much touched in view of their innocence, and will issue orders to free them from the punishments with which they are threatened, and to restore them to the full possession of their property and effects. I've entered into the intercession more readily by the assurance which has always been given to me by these people of their submissive and peaceable spirit, who conduct themselves with absolute subjection and obedience, towards those in authority, leading a peaceful and industrious life, and willingly paying the taxes to the state and country where they reside, and by where they make themselves useful by vitality and labor. Over the next 3 years, the Dutch States General continued William III's intercession, and finally did succeed in gaining the property back for these Mennonites who their property was taken. So how did this intercession impact religious toleration? So the edicts that justified persecution by Charles V in the 16th century were disregarded. And significantly, the Dutch government used the good behavior of Mennonites in the Netherlands to argue that religious toleration should be practiced more broadly. So overall, the impact of political lobbying was, in some cases, alleviation happened. Dutch Mennonites, as good citizens, demonstrated that religious toleration worked. And finally, arguments for religious toleration spurred discussion about religious toleration and brought accountability. So this project does not trace the long-term impact, but we know that religious toleration is prevalent today. So I argue that undermining persecutions through political lobbying laid the groundwork for religious toleration, even if it did not bring immediate results. So finally, how Mennonites impacted the intellectual development of religious toleration. So during the 1680s, John Locke, a medical doctor and political philosopher from England, traveled to the Netherlands because he was in exile. The Catholic ruler James II didn't like what John Locke was about, so he had to flee to the Netherlands. And while there, he stayed with his friend Philippus van Limburg, a fellow doctor, who was also a Remonstrant theologian that wrote on religious toleration and was also interested in helping alleviating the Mennonite suffering under because of Swiss persecutions. And the reason Limburg was interested in these persecutions was because of Galenus Abrahams de Haan, who was a trained doctor and also a Mennonite minister. And he also was involved with heading up relief efforts with the Dutch Foreign Aid Committee to the destitute refugees, like the people that were exiled from the Swiss cantons. So through Limburg, Locke would have interacted with Abrahams and learned about the persecution of Swiss Anabaptists, specifically at a meeting. All three doctors were involved in an intellectual society where they talked about medical things because they were all three medical doctors, but this medical society was also known for talking about intellectual matters. So from that, it's almost certain that John Locke became very aware of the relief efforts happening in the Swiss cantons. But the likelihood of this is heightened by John Locke's letter on toleration, where he specifically mentions Anabaptists twice. He writes, here's one example. But those whose doctrine is peaceful and whose morals are pure and blameless should be treated on the same terms as their fellow citizens. And if gatherings, solemn assemblies, celebration of feast days, sermons, and public worship are permitted at all, they should all be permitted on equal terms to Remonstrants, anti-Remonstrants, Lutherans, and Anabaptists. In his letter on toleration, John Locke also mentions the issue of infant baptism as not being something people should be persecuted about. So, because of Locke's association with those involved in Mennonite relief and his mention of Anabaptists, it seems very likely that Swiss persecutions were part of what motivated him to write his letter on toleration. Locke was later very influential in bringing toleration in England and also in America. Thus, Mennonites, by influencing Locke to write on toleration, influenced the intellectual development of religious toleration in the West. So, a brief summary. My thesis was that the 17th century Dutch Mennonites and Swiss Anabaptists contributed to the rise of religious toleration in early modern Europe by influencing all levels of the communities where they lived: common people, church leaders, intellectuals, and political leaders. So, with social toleration, you have common people being influenced towards religious toleration. With political and intellectual lobbying, church leaders, intellectuals, and political leaders are being influenced towards religious toleration by Mennonites. And finally, through the intellectual development of intellectual elites and political leaders are being influenced. So, to conclude, I want to include a quote by Carlos Eyre, who we're all going to see speak in a few weeks at our graduation, and we're excited for that. So, Eyre, in his book about the Reformation, which we read for Reformation class last semester, writes, quote, "If historians were to pay attention only to movements that involve large numbers of people, the entire radical Reformation could easily be overlooked. But the radicals are significant beyond their numbers for several reasons." So the radicals would include Mennonites and Anabaptists as well as others. So Eyre lists three contributions that Anabaptists gave. One of these, significantly, is that they championed religious toleration in the 16th century with their views about freedom of voluntary participation in church rather than forced. So he argues that he lists three contributions, but one of them is religious toleration. He argues that these might be among the most significant made by anyone in the 16th century. And I might add that it continued into the 17th century, as my project tries to demonstrate. So also, Eyre mentions that Anabaptists are often overlooked. So my project sought to highlight how Anabaptists contributed to modern society through helping inspire religious toleration. And so I think that the fact that Mennonites contributed to the modern idea of religious toleration should spark interest in Anabaptist history for historians. Furthermore, there are aspects that I didn't address in this paper because I just didn't have the space for it, but the Dutch Mennonite foreign aid would be a really interesting thing for further research, seeing how the Dutch Mennonite foreign aid, which was administered to Mennonites throughout Europe, how that relates to the rise of humanitarian culture more broadly in Europe during this time, because such commissions, although they are common today, were not common in the 17th century. So the story of Dutch aid, along with their intercession, is a story of brotherly love and of ecumenical action between Remonstrants, Reformed, and Mennonites. The Mennonites in the Netherlands also had their disagreements amongst each other and with the Swiss Anabaptists. Yet, despite these differences, they worked together with those of other confessions to promote religious toleration and administer foreign aid. So this story is important for modern people, especially historians, Mennonites, and Christians, because we too need to learn to work together despite our differences to make our world a better place for those in need.